We've seen our fair share of crazy drivers on the road, but how many of those can actually be labeled as dead drivers? If you were to go by the common definition of a dead driver, which is a person who has lost all consciousness and is unresponsive to any external stimuli, what if we were to define a dead driver as someone who is actually deceased, like has kicked the bucket, bit the bullet, shuffled off this mortal coil, died? Just to be clear, well, that kind of dead driver is much less common, but they do happen from time to time. How common exactly? The car had been left there for weeks and the corpse had begun to decompose. Who was the driver? Why was he there? Nobody knows. The case was never solved and the man was buried in a mass grave with other unidentified dead people. So yeah, that's one kind of dead driver. But what about the other two? Well, let's talk about them right after. After all, accidents are one of the leading causes of death worldwide. And according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, about 40,000 people die in car accidents in the United States each year. Some are sad, some are tragic, and some are just plain weird. But no matter how they got there, one thing is for sure, dead drivers are definitely something to be on the lookout for. Just remember, if you see a driver who looks like he's sleeping, don't assume he's just tired. He might be dead. So it stands to reason that some of those people are still driving when they die, right? Well, yes, but it's not as common as you might think. Most of the time, if a person is involved in a serious car accident, they're going to be knocked unconscious or at least seriously injured. And if they're not, they usually won't be able to stay in control of their car for very long. There are exceptions, of course. In 2018, a man in Ohio named Anonymous was killed in a two-car collision. But after he was hit, his body remained in his car and he drove away from the scene of the accident. He traveled for nearly a mile before crashing into a ditch. At first, police were baffled by the incident. They couldn't understand how someone could be driving while dead. But eventually they figured out what happened. Anonymous had sustained a traumatic brain injury in the accident, but he had also somehow managed to avoid a spinal cord injury. As a result, his brain was dead, but the rest of his body was still functioning, albeit without any real control. Well, that is hard to say because these kinds of deaths are relatively rare and often go unreported or misreported. A man named Anonymous was driving down the road when he was struck by a piece of flying metal. The object went straight through his windshield and hit him in the head. He was knocked unconscious immediately and his car veered off the road. But instead of stopping, his car kept going. It traveled down a hill and over a bridge. The entire time the dead man was still gripping the steering wheel. Eventually the car came to a stop and Anonymous was found lying on the floor of his vehicle. He had been dead for quite some time, but he had managed to travel nearly 2 miles while dead. Now this is where things get a little bit more interesting and also a little bit more disturbing. Imagine you're driving down the highway one day when suddenly you feel a sharp pain in your chest. You try to ignore it at first, but then the pain gets worse and worse until you can't take it anymore. You pull over and slump over the steering wheel, completely unaware that you're about to die. Sounds scary, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to a certain man in Texas in 2017. He suffered from a rare medical condition that caused him to continue driving even after he died. His name was Anonymous. He was driving home from a barbecue when he suffered a sudden onset of chest pains. He pulled over to the side of the road and called 911, but by the time emergency services arrived, he was already dead. The only problem was that his body didn't know it yet. Because of his medical condition, his body continued moving even after he died. His foot remained on the gas pedal and his hand remained on the steering wheel. Eventually, his car ran out of gas and he crashed into a ditch. But before that, he managed to drive for nearly 3 miles with a dead body inside. It's not always easy to tell when someone dies behind the wheel, especially if their car doesn't end up in a ditch or on someone's front lawn. In 2006, a woman in Florida named Anonymous was driving to a hospital to visit her husband who was terminally ill. On the way, she began experiencing symptoms of a heart attack, but she pushed through the pain and kept driving. She wanted to see her husband one last time. Unfortunately, she never made it to the hospital. She died in her car in the middle of traffic. And as it turned out, her body stayed in her car for nearly a whole week before anyone noticed. The reason why she wasn't discovered sooner was because of her medical condition. You see, Anonymous was a diabetic, and she had recently started taking a new medication that made her face appear younger. As a result, nobody recognized her when they saw her in her car, and nobody thought to check if she was alive. But some estimates suggest that it happens at least several hundred times a year in the United States alone. Then there are a lot of people out there who fall into that category. In fact, studies have shown that at least 20% of drivers admit to falling asleep behind the wheel at least once in their lifetime. That's a lot of potentially dead drivers out there. But what if we were to take that definition and apply it more literally? So, who are these dead drivers, and how do they end up behind the wheel in the first place? Well, there are all kinds of stories out there about people who have died and driven. But most of them fall into one of three categories: natural causes, medical conditions, and accidents. Let's start with natural causes. This is probably the most straightforward and least creepy of the three categories. People die every day from old age, heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, whatever. And sometimes those deaths occur while the person is driving. It is not unheard of for an elderly person to die peacefully in their sleep while driving home from the grocery store or something. Granted, this kind of thing doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. When it does, it's usually not much of a problem. The car will eventually come to a stop on its own, and the driver simply dies in a peaceful and non-traumatic way. Occasionally, however, the driver may continue driving for some time after they die, which could be dangerous, especially if the car ends up in the wrong hands. In 2014, for example, a dead body was found slumped over the steering wheel of a car in a Walmart parking lot. Okay, so let's move on to the second category: medical conditions. Believe it or not, this isn't even the most bizarre case of a dead driver caused by a medical condition. But enough about medical conditions. What about the third category of dead drivers: accidents? That's a pretty bizarre story, but it has nothing compared to another similar case that occurred in New York in 2011. As you can see, there are all kinds of stories out there about dead drivers and how they ended up behind the wheel. Now you need to watch what really happens to your body after you die. Or check out this video instead.